all the conspiracy theories, and even if maybe it's one that's not provable but something you think about, which one's your favorite rabbit hole to go down?
Well, it's funny, I'm embarrassed to say I sort of bought the conventional view of most things up until several years ago when the evidence just, forced me to reassess because it was just so obvious that there was a lot of lying going on, a lot. And I have since become convinced, based on an overwhelming amount of evidence, that a lot of the biggest stories in certainly the last 100 years, maybe longer, have been really distorted. Like, we don't actually know what happened, but we know that people have been lying about it consistently, and then those lies solidify into history, and if they're not questioned by anybody. So, I mean, I could go down a long list. It's not just the Kennedy assassination or 9/11, both of which are, clearly there's a lot going on there in both cases. I'm really bothered, honestly, by the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. I think it's really clear, both common sense dictates, but also there was a Senate inquiry into it during the Second World War, which was kind of suppressed because the war was on. But the fact that the U.S. government knew or had an understanding there was a very high likelihood that our Pacific fleet would be hit and thousands would die in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, by Japan, they allowed that. And then they allowed all the U.S. servicemen in the Philippines, in Corregidor and Manila, to be killed and captured, which they were. I mean, Roosevelt and his war planning staff, allowed that to happen. I think it's clear. And that's a monstrous crime. You should never allow your countrymen to be killed. I just can't even imagine that. And I'm sure that Roosevelt, I have no doubt, told himself, we're doing this for a higher good, and they wanted to get involved in the war in Europe. It couldn't be a voluntary war. We had to be responding to an attack. And clearly they allowed that. And I can't imagine how Roosevelt lived with himself. He didn't live much longer, actually. And I just think it's a really big deal. If the US government would do that, or a president would do that, like, we need to rethink our relationship to the state. In my opinion, no one ever talks about that, but I think it's entirely real. And there's a lot of evidence that it is. So, yeah, I'm interested in that.
And we understand that both sides are corrupt. We understand that there's corruption within the government. But what's the solution? You can't just burn it all down.
Of course not. And you also need to be honest with yourself about the way people are. People are really flawed. There's never been a pure human institution because people aren't pure. And they're a mixture of good and bad. And it's all sorts of roiling, competing interests within everybody. But I think that we should be honest about it because that's the only hope of improving it. You're never going to get to perfect. You can get to better. I grew up in a better country than the one we have now. I'm not that old. I graduated from high school in 1987. It was a much better country in a lot of different ways than the one we're currently occupying. So we can get to better for sure. I also, if you seriously want to know a question that I have that I don't think has been fully answered, that I've never heard anybody else mention, but I feel it strongly. It's like, where did nuclear technology come from? And the Manhattan Project and the Germans were working on all this stuff, but it's like, I don't know, at least to a non-specialist, which I am very much a non-specialist. I'm not a nuclear engineer, but I've never really seen that clearly explained. And I had a friend who once was just a journalist, but who was once working on this topic. And he said to me, who's going to write a book on it. And he said, I'm not sure what's going on there, but there was a lot of lying around that, more than just the secrecy, of course, that shrouded the Manhattan Project because they didn't want the Japanese to know. But he said it's more than that. And I don't really know. And so I've always sort of wondered, like, are we sure we know where this came from? Because it was a history-changing technology that I think hurt, obviously, the Japanese quite a bit, but also hurt us and hurt the world. And like, what is that? Are we positive we know? I don't think we are. No one else cares or is curious, but I am.
And interesting enough, they don't want you to use that technology to generate power anymore. So why create it, why use it, and then not let people use it? It's even weirder, no?
No, because only weapons are virtuous. I don't know if you know this, man.
Yeah.
Cluster bombs are absolutely awesome, but your wood stove is a threat to the climate. It's totally fine to blow up the Nord Stream pipeline, the largest man-made emission of CO2 in human history, because Russia but it's totally bad for you to use a fireplace or drive an F-150. I just want you to know kind of the moral framework we're working within.